Today, I'd like to discuss a much maligned film and hopefully reevaluate one of the primary elements of the film that has received criticism. It's one of the more common criticisms that I've seen online, and a criticism which I held myself for quite some time until I had a change in perspective. The film we're going to be talking about today is Christopher Nolan's 2020 sci-fi espionage thriller, Tenet. First, some context. My experience with Tenet was the same as a lot of people's, and it went like this. As a longtime fan of Christopher Nolan's films, I waited eagerly for this film for a year or so, then sat down in the theater when it was finally released in the middle of the pandemic to be treated to a thought-provoking and exciting film that was more or less spoiled by questionable sound mixing choices that made it difficult to understand what was already some of Christopher Nolan's weakest dialogue as a screenwriter. I imagine your experience was similar, but none of those issues are the point today. And before we get to today's point, I should warn you, of course, that spoilers lie ahead. Today, our goal is to examine one of the more highly criticized elements of the film besides the sound mixing, something more connected to the story itself, and that is the name of the protagonist, a name which we only know as the protagonist. That's right, if you haven't seen the film, the protagonist of the film is literally named the Protagonist. And if you have seen the film, this probably created some question marks. He's identified as such in the credits and in the screenplay. Fans of the film online affectionately refer to him as TP because the protagonist is just a little bit awkward to say. The character himself, during a moment in the film when his role in the mission is called into question, reminds another character that he is, quote, the protagonist in this operation. No hint is given in the film or outside of the film as to his actual name. One of the leading criticisms of the film has been that it is simply difficult to care for characters without knowing anything about them. Both John David Washington's protagonist and Robert Pattinson's supporting character, Neil, receive very little fleshing out over the course of the story. Let's take Robert Pattinson's character for starters. His character is named Neil. We know that he majored in physics. He knows a number of languages, including Estonian, but not including backwards talk. That's most of what we know about Neil in terms of personal details. John David Washington's protagonist, on the other hand, we know even less about. We know from Neil that the protagonist never drinks on the job, but enjoys a Diet Coke. We know that he likes hot sauce and doesn't like to be kept waiting for it. We know that he used to work for the CIA, and at the end of the film, again, spoiler alert, we learn from what happens on screen that he goes on to found the organization of Tenet. But that's about it. Unlike Neil, we don't even know his actual name. And this became a sticking point for a lot of people who found that the characterization within the film left much to be desired. Writing for Deep Focus Reviews, Brian Eggert writes, Tenet suffers most from its absence of feeling and thinly described characters, leaving Nolan's cinematic puzzle box a contraption with nothing inside for those who attempt to solve it. For Vox, Alyssa Wilkinson writes, Tenet fails to give us enough reason to care about its characters, though it seems to try. We certainly come to care about the characters by virtue of their hero status, their chemistry together, and the actors' performances that brought them to life. But other than that, we simply don't know much about them, including their personal stakes and motivations. The character of Kat overcompensates for the lack of clarity in the male protagonists by constantly reminding the viewers of her fear for her son, even at oddly timed moments. Now, the argument I would like to make today is that our lack of knowledge of our protagonists, while it has a distancing effect on the audience, is actually very much in keeping with what little characterization the movie does provide, as well as with some recurring themes from the film, in a way that actually contributes to making the film a more unified whole. Simply stated, by hiding everything about the protagonist from us, right down to his real name, Nolan handles us, the probing audience, the same way the protagonist handles the world around him. Nolan hides the protagonist's true identity from us, just like the protagonist, as a secret agent, protects his own identity. It's a sort of meta storytelling device that's actually pretty intriguing, and as we'll see, it operates on a couple of levels, in the movie and outside of it. So let's jump into it. In one of the earliest scenes of the film, the protagonist, setting out for the first time on what will become the central mission of the film, meets a scientist, named Barbara in the screenplay, but never on screen in the film itself. She debriefs him on the principle of inverted entropy, which is causing objects from the future to travel backwards in time through the past. I know, just go with it. It's here, right out of the gate, that the scientist warns the protagonist not to engage in any small talk, so as not to risk revealing anything about their personal lives. If one agent knows another agent's identity, then it will be possible for an antagonist to find out and compromise the mission. This introduced the idea of the protagonist hiding his identity to preserve secrecy, which will only come to be fleshed out further. Later on in the film, when planning the plutonium heist in Estonia, the protagonist instructs Neil to plan as much off of the books as possible. We learn from the plane heist ending up in the newspaper that anything with a paper trail could ultimately expose their actions to anybody in the future with prying eyes. Something documented today creates a record for someone to read tomorrow, possibly someone with the ability to invert entropy and reach into the past to cause trouble. We see this at work when Sator has the drawing removed from the Freeport in the past after learning of the plane crash in the news later on. The heroes further demonstrate their commitment to secrecy and how they hide information not just from posterity, but from each other. At the end of the film, when on the Magna Viking, the protagonist only shares certain details while withholding others, even from Neil and Kat, his most trusted allies. Knowledge divided, they say. Each of them only knows what details they need to play their part. If any one of them is caught and has the full details of the plan, then it is game over for the mission. It is not knowing the details that protects the mission should any one of them become compromised. Ignorance is our ammunition, they say. The people they are fighting have the benefit of knowledge of the past. The heroes must leave as few breadcrumbs as possible. With the protagonist's name withheld from us, the audience becomes an analog for the Twilight world of the film. The protagonist is so committed to this core tenet of absolute secrecy, of weaponized ignorance, of divided knowledge for the sake of the mission, that his life, his story, his motivations, his very name are withheld from the viewers themselves. Obviously, strong characterization is one of the core tenets of quality storytelling, and an audience's ability to connect with and invest in a character is one of the most rewarding parts of storytelling in general. In this regard, I can understand a lot of the desire to learn more about the character. However, there is also something to be said for weaving the themes of a film into the other elements of the story, for creating a more unified and unique whole out of letting theme dictate things like character, setting, etc. Here, that audience-character connection is sacrificed in order to better demonstrate the character's commitment to his principles, which is at the core of the character and at the entire film. We don't know the protagonist's real name because it is in character for him not to share it with us, so much so that the screenplay itself denies the privileged viewer the usual privilege of knowing a character's very name. Knowledge divided indeed. Now at this point you might be asking, it makes plenty of sense in-universe for the protagonist to hide his identity. We all know what a secret agent is, but why hide his identity from the audience? It's not even listed in Nolan's own screenplay. Well, it's time to contrast the conversation around the protagonist's identity to the conversation around Neil's identity. As you may know, shortly after the movie came out, there is a very popular fan theory online that said Kat's son Max would grow up to become Neil, that the character we know as Neil was actually Max all grown up. Most of this fan theory was built entirely on two facts. The first is that Robert Pattinson had to dye his hair blonde for the role. Most people attributed that to the fact that the character of Max's hair was also blonde. Why have Pattinson dye his hair if it wasn't for a reason? Personally, I attribute it more to another fan theory that says that Neil serves as Nolan's self-insert in the film. But that's besides the point. The second fact that was used to justify this fan theory is the fact that Max could be short for the name Maximilian, which, when spelled backwards and shortened, would spell Neil. Neil is literally the backward version of Maximilian. Now, regardless of what you actually think of these fan theories, I'm really intrigued by how knowing only Neil's name and hair color, along with his British accent and high-end attire, caused so many viewers to speculate about the true nature of his identity in the movie, and allowed them to pinpoint one of the other characters specifically. Given a few simple details, including the names of two totally different characters, the audience assembled an entire narrative around the truth behind a character's identity, demonstrating in the real world exactly the kind of secret identity sleuthing that Nolan was trying to protect his protagonist from. Seeing how the real world responded to knowing Neil's name provides a perfect justification for why hiding the name of the protagonist was in keeping with the themes of the film. To get close to Sator, says Priya, would take a fresh-faced protagonist, someone unknown who could remain unknown, even to the audience.